So today I was excited. This is going to be a little bit more of a discussion, but I do want to share a few sort of main points around our topic for today, which is regulation, policy making, and governance. And I think for me, one of the reasons that this fell, even though I hadn't really thought about it ahead of time, since I booked these sessions out so far in advance, um, I realize there's probably not a better topic around AI to discuss, right? Basically a month, less than a month before the election, than this particular topic, which is really about, the role that the government's going to play, that leaders are going to play. And, I just think this is an interesting time to, like I said, have this conversation, to think about these things. Now, don't get me wrong. I want to honor and validate that for a lot of us, when it comes to the election, there's many different issues to address. And so this is not to say that the AI issue should be the single issue on which you are looking at voting or politicians or things like that. But I do think that, as we look at the people that we elect into office to be our leaders and we look at the values they represent, we're going to find that the AI conversation has a lot to do with our core values. And, leading up to this particular conversation today, I think we've covered a lot of the topics in the last few months that are related to the values, right? Things like diversity, things like creative and intellectual property, right? Things like job displacement. Um, these are functional societal issues that we're going to be, having to deal with as we go forward, but they are really related. How people feel about them is really related to the values that they hold. And I just see that as kind of all leading us to this conversation right now as we head into November around regulation, policy making, and governance. And, I think when it comes to this, there's so many different directions we can go because we're literally creating this as we speak, right? This sort of artificial intelligence policy making and law making is a completely new world. And it's something where there's not a lot of precedent. There's some, but it's very hard to take what we're doing with technology at this point and fit it into some of the things we've done in the past. And just to give you an example, a lot of times we compare this sort of AI revolution to these other types of revolutions we've had, right? Like the Industrial Revolution. Um, I think it's really important. I was listening to an AI ethics conversation this morning on Trevor Noah's podcast. And one of the things that I appreciated got said is that, the difference is that artificial intelligence, unlike a lot of other things that have technologically shifted our world, isn't a tool, it's an agent. And I thought it was an interesting perspective, right? Really boiling it down to that idea that AI has the ability to make decisions, solve problems, have opinions, right? And because of that, it is really different than a lot of the other stuff that we have done in the past. So although we're looking towards history for examples of how to move into this space of actually having regulation and policy and laws, at the same time, it's really hard because we are in this very sort of new world kind of situation where I think we have to innovate past maybe what we've done previously. I wanted to touch really quick on just the idea, that what are these things, right? Like when we say regulation, policy making, governance, I think we all sort of know what those are, but I just wanted to clearly put them into my slide deck today. That regulation is really about creating rules and directives that are maintained by some sort of authoritative body, right? It's the action or process of being regulated or regulating. And that basically means it's the action or process of controlling or maintaining the rate or the speed of something so that it can work properly. It's the process of controlling or supervising something by creating some standards. And it's also a way to kind of, create or set these standards for things that are technical equipment, machinery, or even just, it's a complex structure within an organizational system. We have to figure out a way to standardize that so we can understand it. And so regulation is really about that process, right? I think especially what stood out to me is this, controlling or maintaining the rate or speed of something so it operates properly. And that's where when we get into the idea of regulation, I think sometimes we'll be like, oh, we don't want the government in our business. And especially as businesses and especially in the tech world, we're going to argue we need the freedom to innovate. But I'm like, all we're asking is that we control or maintain the rate and the speed of what we're doing here so that we can use AI to its highest good, right? And I think there's a good argument to make there. Policymaking is getting more specific and really taking that regulation and putting it into practice, right? So how do we actually formulate the policies? How do we actually establish a policy? How do we practice that policy? And a lot of this is going to come down to our governments, whether they're local, national, international, state, and that's going to be, I think, a huge process, right? Where different places are going to have different perspectives on how we take our ideas about how we should regulate and turn them into actionable items. And again, the reason I think this conversation is so important because of the election is because we're literally in the middle of making the decision right now about how this will be governed and who will be governing it, right? So the people that are going to oversee and control the direction of AI, the people that are going to be able to claim that they have some sort of sovereignty and authority to exercise these policies or laws or regulations. The people that are going to influence this entire situation and are going to determine what direction we go as we sort of embark on this new process. And we've been embarking on it, but we still haven't gotten to the point where we're in a real action place, right? We're in a lot of talking places right now, but action is still a little bit behind. And so it's really important to understand when it comes to governance, our elected officials in a lot of ways are going to become these people, right? They're going to be the ones that are taking some of these first steps over the next few years on every level of government. Like I said, both local, state, national, international. And so I do think it's really important. Like I said, we go back to that values piece and really think about, how are people going to look at this? Because when they start to put their values, their beliefs in action, it is going to have a direct effect on everybody. So I did want to throw out like, what can we do? And I will just be honest with you all from my perspective. I'm like over politics right now. I'm very political as a personal person. I'm very involved in politics. But I'm really over it right now. I was sort of exhausted before the hurricane. I really can't handle it at this point. And that's because for the last 3 weeks, evidently there's no politicians in America who know how to turn off the regional settings of their texting and their advertising. It would have been really great if they could have stopped asking me for money the last 3 weeks on my phone when I only got tiny little bits of self-service. And I'm like, all you got to do is say, blot out half of North Carolina. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, don't send these text messages to people in South Carolina. Like, they could have easily done that. So, I feel like we have to just kind of maybe let go of the politics of it. I don't think that's actually the most important thing. I think being civically engaged is the more important thing. And, I think this voting right now is an important political activity, but really, if we don't want to be involved in politics, I think we can just think of voting as a way to be involved in policymaking and regulations, right, on different levels. Because again, we're going to choose the people who step into the governing role on this, and there's going to be a lot of different people with a lot of different opinions. So, what can we actually do? And this isn't just about the election and voting, but I think going forward for the next few years, what can we do? We can talk to local leaders. We can start conversations. We can let them know our concerns. We can really be people who step up and kind of speak that stuff out. I think we have to listen and ask questions as well about the people that are governing, whether we wanted them to be elected or not, and really like ask them to represent themselves on this issue. I kind of feel like every politician should have a page on their website about this. You should be educating yourself. I think it's sad when we have congressional meetings and events and we end up with a bunch of people who have no idea what they're talking about. And I'm like, they have whole staffs that can understand this. A lot of them are younger than us. So there's no excuse that they are not well versed on what's happening. And so I think, really pushing that envelope is going to be valuable. I think we can share information going forward with other voters. And just, tell our friends, our colleagues, the people in our companies, the people in our organizations, hey, did you know this person supports this? This is a thing that I've already been doing in Asheville because we have so many artists here. Like you pointed out, Dean, and, creative and intellectual property is a big deal for them. But if you're not a rich and famous artist, if you're not a celebrity, how are you going to sue OpenAI? Right? So it's been important for us to talk about how, as artists, we can come together and let our leaders know here, we're worried about this. You need to pay attention to this. You need to have some knowledge and education about this so that you're protecting our livelihoods. So that's been a conversation we've been having, I would say for the last 2 years here as different things have happened. And then I would be, I think, leaving out something big if I didn't mention that in addition to our politicians, we have to look at the people who are lobbying them. And understanding who's lobbying the leaders locally and in your state and even across the country can give a lot of insight into understanding what industries, companies, corporations, groups, and I would say influential individuals, I won't name names, there's some influential individuals out there that are definitely, lobbying in their own ways. But who are the people that have the motivation and the ability to invest in convincing the leaders how to govern? I think this is something we have to pay attention to going forward. And just really noting to ourselves, hey, we can see our, state senator is being lobbied by these people and that they have a vested interest in AI governing going one way or the other because it affects directly policies and laws and regulations that they will have to abide by. So I think in the beginning, like I said, the conversation is new. It's not like we can just go out and know the answers to things, but what we can do is, as usual, be asking these questions and talking to people of influence that we know and really paying attention to who's getting involved. And I think it's really key to do that because, again, when I'm working with artists, we really look at, well, who are the vested interests in not protecting creative and intellectual property. And to be quite honest, it's the tech companies themselves, and they have a lot of money to lobby. So I think that's an incredibly important thing to be aware of because artists, especially when they're, growing their businesses and their art form and they're getting in front of more people, a lot of times we're using these tools created by tech companies that behind the scenes are actually in some ways making decisions that are not beneficial for us and spending their money to try to get people in power to make those same decisions. So it's just, I think, a really important, again, values question to think about that. So what's actually being done? Surprisingly, a ton of stuff is moving around. Like I said, I don't feel like there's a lot of laws on the books or things that are 100% like being executed already. Some places have put laws on the books, but they haven't actually activated because, sometimes you make a law, it passes, and then it's like takes 6 months or 12 months or 2 years for that law to go into place and where it can actually be acted upon. But despite the fact that I think there's a little lag time there, we have seen just in 2024 that at least 45 states, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and DC have introduced AI bills. And 31 states have adopted resolutions or enacted some type of legislation, right? So we're moving that dial forward. We're taking steps. And so I just put together a quick list, right? So you could see, like, based on where you live, especially for anybody who's listening to the recording, what's going on in your area, right? So Colorado's already enacted some AI legislation. And again, it's like each state and each kind of country. If you looked at the more international view, you'll see there's different specific ethical issues that are coming to the forefront. So you're rarely going to see a piece of policy that addresses all the ethical problems of AI, right? Because we've been talking about those problems all year. They're big. There's a lot of them. No one law is going to be written about it. So Colorado starts by looking at algorithmic discrimination. right? And how you have to disclose to consumers what you're doing. Florida provided grants to school districts to implement AI in support of teachers and students, so getting them on board in the education system. Hawaii required the University of Hawaii to implement a program to develop a wildfire forecast system after what happened there, right? Indiana created an AI task force. Maryland required the Department of Information Technology to start writing policies and procedures concerning AI. New Hampshire created the crime of the fraudulent use of deepfakes, right? This is something we're seeing come up in legislation more and more. And I would say the most amazing thing about some of the laws and policies around deepfakes is actually individual people are lobbying for that stuff, right? So families who've been impacted by somebody using a deepfake to try to get money from them, tell them that they had taken their child or something of that nature. They are leading it. So it's not always corporations that lobby. Sometimes individual people who've been harmed can really come together and lobby. South Dakota revised its statutes to clarify that a person is guilty of possessing child pornography if the person knowingly possesses a visual depiction of a minor in certain situations. So again, how can we make sure that I can't create something AI based, put it onto somebody's computer, and then call the police on them, right? So just trying to revise some of these criminal laws. Tennessee has been requiring the governing boards of public institutions of higher education to work on this. You'll notice a lot of universities and colleges are very active in the policymaking space around AI because it directly impacts them. Utah's created an AI Policy Act. The Virgin Islands has established a real-time centralized crime data system with the state police department. So really, again, looking at how we're deploying AI in these very serious situations, right? And so Washington State has done some things as well, West Virginia. And you can see, yeah, Kate, I see your comment. Yikes. Yeah, exactly. Sometimes AI is being talked about in relationship to very simple things. And sometimes we're talking about whether or not people get arrested, whether they go to jail, whether they get a mortgage, whether they get a loan, whether they, how the judge decides in their case. We're seeing AI is deployed in a lot of these different places, right? Or different aspects of our public institutions. But again, we're really looking at, I think in all of these cases, how can AI benefit and how can AI harm? And how do we make sure we've written a policy that says we're benefiting people rather than harming them? I think that's sort of one of the things that is the thread between all of these. Because a lot of these situations, the reason the policies are on the table or have been enacted is because the AI has already been deployed. Right? So we're not necessarily like making these laws and then deploying the AI. We're making them after we've deployed. Also, the White House, and this is funny, I'm a big fan of a movement called the Community Bill of Rights. I've studied quite a bit of that politically. And I'm a big fan of just the idea that different bills of rights can be written for different purposes. And so the White House has already started working on what they call the development of a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. And they have a great page on their website. You can click on those links when I send this slide deck out. But they have been working with the Office of Science and Technology Policy to create this blueprint. And the blueprint basically covers, with AI, how to have safe and effective systems, the algorithmic discrimination protections, data privacy, notice and explanation, which has a lot to do with transparency of the systems, and human alternatives, consideration, and fallback. So as we're deploying these things, to your point, Kate, in the chat, as we're deploying these things, we need to be looking at who is being affected, how they're being affected. There needs to be tracking in place. There needs to be an evaluation in place. We need to make sure that when we say, oh, AI is going to take over this job or take over that job or take over this problem, we need to be able to come back, 6 months, a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, and basically say, is this actually working? Is deploying the AI the real solution? Or do we need more people in the mix? We've often found, I think, in the discovery of AI over the last 2 decades, we need human intervention quite a bit, right? To come in and evaluate what's happening. So that's been something I've read a lot about because I'm excited they're working on that. Also, industry-wise, and again, I've linked to this awesome law firm that's doing a little bit of work from the AI perspective to try to clarify, how to handle things. They have a great blog about a number of different aspects of this, but they sort of talk a little bit more, again, from the industry perspective. The Federal Aviation Administration is creating policy around AI. The National Defense Authorization Act of 2019 was the Department of Defense figuring out policy-wise how they can start to undertake AI-related activities, right? And to appoint somebody to be in charge of overseeing it, right? The National AI Initiative Act of 2020, right, created the National Artificial Intelligence Initiative Office. So again, we have these different things that have to do with where's AI being deployed? We know these systems are already being used. Who's checking on them? Who's making sure they work? Who's making sure people are protected and there's not harm happening? And how can we make sure that as a country as a whole, that our industries are being viewed from that perspective? There's also, a lot of kind of public hearings going on, like I said, and talking in the Senate, and that's been going on for quite a while. But the US lawmakers aren't just doing more public stuff, they're also holding a lot of closed door listening sessions to try to understand different perspectives of this. I think sometimes it's hard when they're doing closed door sessions because I feel like that's where the lobbying happens. So again, pay attention to who shows up to those closed door sessions and who they're talking to, because I think it says a lot about the perspective that we're going to have to try to understand going forward from some of the real influencers on our governing bodies. But again, there's a lot of examples of how we're trying to move things forward, right? With guidelines, with different proposed regulations and acts. And some of this, again, is all very specific, has to do with political advertisement, right? Has to do with setting standards for AI developers. Things like the Stop Spying Bosses Act, right? So can companies surveil their employees? Is that allowed? Typically, no, you can't just surveil your employees every time they're at your office. But with AI, we don't really have any regulation around that. So what does it mean if we're sending out those AI systems to check on our people and analyze what they're doing and kind of surveil their work throughout the day? Again, no fakes. So that deep fake issue, protecting voice and visual likenesses. And the AI Research, Innovation, and Accountability Act, which I think is very valuable, is really about forcing the tech companies into more transparency and accountability and security, while also saying we want you to innovate. We want you to bring things to people that will help them. We want you to enhance our society and our country. But I think at the same time, we also need to know what you're doing and you need to be able to explain it. And there needs to be some regularity with how often you explain that. So I want to go through, just to hear from you both, some questions that I have, and I'm going to stop sharing just so we can talk about it all together. And these questions I sort of posed in the slide deck is something, again, that you can take with you and potentially ask other people, to think about these things. I think the 5 questions I've put together are pretty good. Again, if you decide you want to talk to local leaders or talk to decision makers, what kind of questions can you ask them about what they think? And I think these are a pretty good guideline. But I'm curious to hear from either of you. Are you currently familiar with any AI laws or regulations or policies where you are in your region or your industry? Is there anything that you see that's like an actual, movement forward towards standards?
I can say I am not aware of any. I honestly have not heard anybody talking about it or researched it myself. I will be now.
Mm.
As far as my industry, like I've always had a problem with intellectual property laws, and I don't feel they're updated like as they should be with advances in technology. And, in the arts community and especially craft, people are so willing to share, you know, to the point where what do they own? you know? Um, and if you don't share, how are you going to advance the craft? Um, or keep it going. So there's a lot of questions.
Kate, anything you want to throw in about stuff you know about in your area? And
Yeah,
feel free to jump
I'm
on in.
typing up something, but yeah, I work in affordable housing for San Francisco, and the main one I've seen is the HUD kind of released this a couple months ago, basically saying, hey, it's kind of concerning when we use algorithmic processes in tenant screening or in like the advertising of housing opportunities. And so I was happy to see this. I mean, this is nowhere near enough, and I have like a lot of thoughts and uh, like um, things to add on like a lot of things we just covered because it's really a concerning thing of just how much corporate company interest is in this process and how now governments, civic entities have really kind of totally latched on to this idea of using AI, and it's really concerning. And kind of what you spoke to about like organizations not really knowing what they're talking about, like some of these proposals coming out of like the California governor's office, for example, was like trying to use generative AI to uh, basically basically wanting to just connect information sources together. Like it's kind of like almost absurd and nonsensical to read some of these proposals because it just seems like full of buzz terms without like really addressing like real problems. Anyway, I can get into it more, but it's yeah, this is a lot of things I've been looking for here in Nebraska where I'm at. There's not much that I've seen, um, but yeah, definitely curious to see if there is.
Yeah, and I really appreciated you sharing the White House's AI Advisory Committee members list, because I think that's a great example of what I brought up, right? I'm going to add that to the slide deck where the member list, it's like it's basically the president and CEO of like every technology company in our country, pretty much, right? So, and then it's all sorts of, some professors, some software people, but a lot of the people that are influencing, again, even the White House and the government from a generalized perspective, it's people that are directly involved in some of the money making aspects of this thing. So it's like, to me, that's always the hard part, right? Even when you see that people are from a university or something of that nature, it doesn't mean that they're not invested financially in some of these different companies that are coming out right now. And so I really appreciate you sharing that because I think that's an important thing. And I think tenant screening, is just a huge issue. That's actually coming up in so many different places. Job screenings as well, like anything where they want to take generative AI and make it super fast to crunch a bunch of data and then pick, which person is the best or which group of people are the best. We're finding that it's problematic, like literally every time. That's like, I think the hardest thing about watching something like the governor's office, focus on that as a solution when there's all these studies showing that that stuff is so imperfect. And, that's like, again, I've listened to a lot of conversations about judges using it to decide correct sentencing. That's been going on for quite a long time. And so that's where it's just wild to think about the fact that we would implement those things with like a very valid knowledge that they're discriminatory. But we do it anyway. And that's what I'm saying. Politicians, I think we need to press them to have more knowledge about what they're talking about. The next question I was curious about is, and this is going to be hard because I'm going to ask you to sort of, focus down on maybe your top 1 to 3 concerns, because I think everything is concerning. But what are you most concerned about right now when you see that there's so little regulation, so little policy on the books right now? What is it that stands out to you as like, something that you're really worried about? And I know, Cade, maybe you could jump in because you already brought up that issue of working on affordable housing. Um, is there anything else in addition to that that you feel like is really like, where would you want to start with policy, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and it is hard to narrow it down. Um, one thing I've been trying to focus on is like so much AI regulation and policy, and even like the movements of like ethical AI or AI for good, right, are still kind of rooted in this like techno deterministic, like, hey, AI can be good. Hey, we should use AI. It is an inherently a thing we have to like figure out. And we're seeing that with some of the bills you mentioned that are like requiring the use of AI for this product or this initiative. And I see it at my company a lot where there's grants contingent on using AI. And that's concerning for my day to day. It's like, oh, Google's kind of requiring people to use generative AI in like spaces like affordable housing and like social benefits just so they can receive funding. Like that's messed up. But sorry, to answer your question, I really think we need in general more community organization and activists involved in this process. What's most concerning for me is the people who are using these services to apply for welfare or to apply for affordable housing or who are in the criminal justice system, right? They have no agency or no choice to have these systems deployed upon them. There's no way for them to opt out. And then as we increasingly embed these systems into government processes, it's concerning. Like in order to participate and receive things, you have to use AI. And so that's where I'm most concerned because of all the flaws and problems and overhyped bullshit, for lack of a better term, about AI. We should not be like inserting it into every aspect of our society. So I want to see more activists involved in this process and companies developing this stuff to actually talk to people who are being impacted. So from a policy standpoint, I don't know. I do like, some of those things about, anti-discrimination. And I would just love to see somehow more policies that say, hey, AI is banned from this, like, facial recognition bans, right? Like things like that. But yeah, I'll have to think on that a little more. Hopefully that's someone answers the question.
Yeah, and I want to say I'm going to combine this just so you can jump in, Dean, too, because you're alluding to the next question I had, which is about, who do you think should be governing in this situation? Who should be creating policy and regulation? I think these two questions are really related, right? And I agree with you. I think more people that are impacted have to be part of the conversation. And I know for me, when it comes to just like policy and regulation, I think the first place I want to start is before we get into all the different specific things that people can do is what you talked about, right? Is like we need to have a sort of standard around how quickly we deploy these things, how fast they are implemented, and that we get to ask some questions in that implementation process instead of forcing everybody into it. And I feel like in a lot of ways, social media companies are the ones that kind of snuck this into the cultural mindset because they forced us to use it and we just didn't know it, right? So every time we're scrolling our social media, we're being forced into the use of these AI systems, and they kind of set a tone that benefits them in a huge way. And that's where I think like that process of actually deployment needs to be regulated first, that we can't just start sticking this in everywhere. And it'll be interesting, I think, in our country to see, because I do think there are some places that would already like to ban it. And I think it's going to be interesting to see, like, again, on that local, national, state levels, where these things fall and what that looks like, because we have, so many different layers of regulation and policy making. What about you, Dean? Is there like sort of issues that stand out to you as a place that you think policy should start? Or,
There
how do you
is,
feel about who's making the decisions?
right? Definitely what Aid was talking about. But also it's something I've been thinking about a lot, and you you've touched on it, but the algorithms and like monetizing this so that the one that the information you're going to get is by the person who bid the highest on it, and what that can do to people's ability to like discern what is good information and what is bad.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because what I said earlier, about how AI is it's not a tool, it's an agent. Because of my studies of social media, when I think about all the things that we've been looking at for the last decade around persuasive technology, right? And now we're basically taking technology that has the ability to become a true agent of persuasion, right? It has been, but we're advancing its ability to persuade us. I think that's, like a big question about what to do about that. Because if it is all driven on clickbait, right, and getting the highest level of emotion and reaction out of people,
Right.
and not really serving them, but actually serving the company and this sort of consumerist values, and this idea that, data is a way to, get people to do things. I mean, I have to say, as a marketing person, I mean, this called my entire career into question at different times, right? Because
know.
where we were 25 years ago and where I am now, I can't believe we were allowed to do some of the things we were doing in that first 10 years of my career. It just seems so crazy that we were allowed to do some of that stuff because it was so blatantly spamming and it was so blatantly manipulating people and crossing over their privacy and security boundaries. But we just didn't have a context for that yet. And so I feel like that's like sort of the same process we're in now. It's like, I don't even have language or context all the time for what I'm talking about here. But I know that it might not go in a good direction because we're already having those problems. So I just see what you're saying is so important because it's really, to me, that argument that, let's say, the Center for Humane Technology has been making about persuasive technology and how the deployment of AI inside of things like social media is causing major cultural damage. That stuff to me has really powerfully changed how I perceive my own job. And even as a business owner, how I perceive how we're doing business and what that means. Because as everything has become so large scale, it's, such a big deal. I don't know if either of you listened to Yuval Noah Harari. He's like a historian that talks a lot about AI. He wrote the book Sapiens, and he just released a new book, and I can't remember the name. He sometimes comes across controversial, but I'm a big history dork. And I love his perspective on AI because I feel like he starts tapping into some of what we're talking about, right? And he's certainly, I think, making some enemies in the big tech world by really questioning what we just said, that like the fundamental core of what we created was sort of toxic and not good for people. We've just continued it. And now we're going to give it like superpowers. And if we're going to do that, we have to be really thoughtful because we're already seeing the fallout from that, over the last decade and how social media has impacted people.
I don't want to
Yeah, jump on
get
in.
on that point. I think that's super interesting because like from a technical perspective, I still view AI as very much a tool, right? But I think you're right where through the hype, through how we communicate about it, how we think about it, the assumptions we have about algorithmic systems and AI, we treat it as an agent. And I think in a way, through that, like we allow it to become an agent. Like what you mentioned about like the marketing practices, right? Like those, what you mentioned as manipulative tactics existed. And now we're just implementing algorithmic systems to do that at a faster speed. So it's like people choosing to use a tool to accelerate it, which kind of means like we are the agents of this, right? And we are using AI to advance our interests or whomever we are, right? And so, and that's what I see a lot in like there's a organization called Distributed AI Research, and they have a really cool podcast called Mystery AI Hype Theater, and they really challenge this idea that AI can make decisions or AI is smart because it's really at the end of the day math, and it doesn't learn. It's really good at mimicking and simulating it, and so that's what I think about a lot is like that nuanced difference between is it actually learning, is it actually doing what we think it is, or is it just pretending and we're just kind of all fooling ourselves, right? And I think that has big implications for how we use it, where we use it. And for me, it's like, gosh, why are we using this stuff? It doesn't even work, but we're
Yeah.
pretending it does. If any of that makes sense. But yeah, that's a really interesting like point about how it's shifted from just like being seen as a tool and it's seen more as like this driving force. But I personally don't think it is.
Yeah, I mean, I will say too, it's just again, because of my social media background and the fact that I've been teaching social media since 2006. So, like basically, even before like Facebook and Twitter and all these sort of well-known platforms came online, I was studying social media with some of the older platforms like Dig and Delicious and Stumble Upon. Um, here's the interesting, I taught for years that social media was a tool and it was not good or bad. It was about who picked it up and used it. The same way a hammer, you can pick it up and you can put beautiful art on the walls. You can pick up a hammer, you can bash somebody's head in. And so I argued to students all the time, social media is a tool. It's like, it's about what you do with it as a brand. It's about your values. It's about how you use it. It's about, it's neither good nor bad, right? I mean, I have to tell you that I had a profound moment around like 2013 where that was challenged for me as an educator and as a basic understanding of how it works because of the AI inside the tool. And when I started really digging deeply into how the AI could be given a goal, and that goal was to create more responses from people, right? And that it would be given all this data so it could understand behaviorally how to create that engagement. Now we were moving a little beyond, this is a tool that we all pick up and we decide what happens with it. Now, neurologically, my brain is being stimulated by this thing. And so how much consciousness do I have around what it does and doesn't do to me? And I think as somebody who's a professional in social media, because I was using it every day, as somebody argued this with me over the course of probably like 2 years, right? What I realized is that I wasn't conscious of it. That my brain was actually really being impacted by the fact that now the feed could really, really crunch every minutia of what I do and don't do, right? It could know every time I paused, every time I scrolled at different speeds. It could know everything I clicked on. It could see all the understanding of my relationships to the other people in the system, right? And so like, that's where I started to really question that, idea of like, is this a tool or have we gone beyond a tool? Because, and the truth is, as I started to study this and think about it and talk to people about it, what I realized is that I was having emotional and mental impacts from my job, that it didn't matter how good my intentions were with the tool, right? And I would argue now, all these years later, that I have a serious social media addiction, and an addiction that I think also spans a good chunk of what's in my smartphone. But like that, I just think that process of living it as a person who was on social media, sometimes 8 hours a day, and even more if I had an event, right? Like that process, you start to realize like, oh, I am not as consciously, rationally making these decisions as I like to think I am, right? There's something else going on here. And so I think it brings that question of like, what is the AI actually doing? Is it really learning? Is that all it's doing? Because that sounds really Pollyanna to me, right? We all want to learn. Learning is good. I believe in that. But is it really learning, or was it given a goal and then given every capability to achieve that goal with a huge amount of information that my brain would never be able to put together by itself? Right. And so it's allowing it to do certain things. So I think that's like an incredibly important question, to be really thinking about now. And I've been thinking about it a long time because I've seen just in myself, anecdotally in my own life, that as AI became deployed more and more in the tools that I use every day for work, that I actually mentally and emotionally suffered, literally, because of it, and had to become much more aware of how much I look at my phone, how much I scroll, how I use social media, how often I use it. I have to have all these guardrails around it because it doesn't take very long for it to just make me have a bunch of feelings that are not mine, right? They're literally being like, there's dopamine in my brain, there's oxytocin in my brain that is actually being triggered. And that gives me like an emotional experience that as humans, we deem that emotional experience very real, which it is, but it is also your brain chemicals being manipulated by a system that was given the goal of doing that specifically. And so is it really learning anything about me or learning anything new about who I am or having any thought about who I am? I doubt it, right? It's like I'm just a number on a giant list of pieces of data, and they want me to do certain things. And that is what the goal of the AI is. So it's like, I think that's where social media to me was like my first sort of understanding of like, whoa, we're moving past just like, oh, this is like a hammer. It's like, not so much, right? There's something else going on here. But yeah, I know we have to wrap up. The other two questions in here that I just want you to think about, and I think again they're related, is what do you think are the biggest challenges to regulation, policy, and lawmaking? And I've included some resources where people are debating this. I think there's lots of challenges in how this is going to go down. I knew that question. We don't have time for that question, right? I feel like there's a lot, especially in an election year. The challenges towards getting these things through are outrageous. I feel like at this point in the election year, we had to realize there's a lot of things that weren't going to move forward until we're into a new session of Congress and a new White House or the same White House or whatever we're doing. We have to get to a place where we've got some stability before these things can move forward. And I think the other question I want everybody to think about is kind of your homework is, how do we get more people to care about this? Again, I realize there are a lot more very direct issues in the world that impact people's ability to survive. Not to be dramatic, but I feel like I'm kind of living through one right now. Right? Like our literal ability to function in my city was completely shut down on multiple levels, which had never happened before. So losing water, electricity, internet, all forms of cell service, right? Like I said, the first week that I was stuck in my house with no way to talk to anybody but the people in my neighborhood, we were listening to the radio in our cars to know what was happening in the rest of the city. That felt very crazy that we went back to. I love the radio, but I didn't expect them to be the only ones still going, right? When the hurricane hit. And so, I feel like there's all these issues that are so pressing and so important. And I think one of the ways that we can just think about how do we get more people to care about this stuff is, I think, Cade, you really made some good points. It's because in a lot of ways, those values, those things that you care about, that are about you being able to make it in this world, we don't realize how much of AI is actually directly related to those things, directly related to whether or not you get a home, whether you have enough money, whether you're able to get access to the rights that you deserve and the things that you need, whether or not you're able to, just like literally kind of do these very basic functions, have a livelihood if you're an artist, right? How do we make sure that those things are still intact? That's just one idea to think about, is how can we really connect this very large issue that has very specific outcomes already happening? How do we connect that for people, right? So that they can see that this is part of the conversation they should be having, rather than adding another issue on top of everything. Because I think that's where we can easily get overwhelmed because there's already too many issues. So I know it's 1 o'clock. I really appreciate y'all. I'm going to send out the recording to everybody and I'll share this deck. Like I said, there's a bunch of clickable resources. Definitely some great articles that I included where you can just debate some things. Cade, as usual, I always pull your links out of the chat and I drop them into the slide deck because you are super knowledgeable and awesome. And I really, really appreciate it. But yeah, thank you all both for joining me today. And yeah, just giving me a little respite from all the stuff going on here. It's great to see you both.
Thank you, and take care of yourself.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and take care.
All right, have a great day.
All right, bye.
Bye.